Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Jess, and I'm Director of Marketing and Strategy at Gravity Union. And we are talking about a very exciting topic, Purview Records Management Strategies for a Successful Start. So whether you are just embarking on your journey or thinking about implementing it, we want to share some tips and strategies and what we've seen works really well. So now I will hand it over to Leanne, and she will get us started with our topic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Leanne Furlong. I'm one of Gravity Union's practice leads for records and information management. So coming here with a background of records management, policy development and instruction, background in library and information studies at UBC, and for some reason, a lot of time spent researching poetry as well. Not a lot of poetry today, but we will be talking about Purview Records Management, where I've had the joy of leading a lot of Purview Records Management implementations for municipalities, regulatory bodies, Crown Corps, energy industry. So really excited to share some of our findings that and hot tips that we've learned from years of practice. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction and background to Purview Records Management. Today, some of the tips we share are going to be really deep dives, and some are going to be more high level. So whether you're brand new to the software or coming with a little bit of experience, I'm hoping there'll be something for everyone here. And we'll talk about some key lessons for adoption, from governance to getting your retention schedule right for Purview, information architecture and SharePoint, et cetera, and we'll also be looking at a case example of Purview Records Management for auto classification and action against council meeting records. And at the end, we'll be delighted to take your questions. So for those who are newer to Purview Records Management, or what that is, Purview Records Management is one solution available through Microsoft Purview's broader suite of information governance solutions. So built within that, there's also, you may have heard of sensitivity labels, data loss prevention, e-discovery. Records management is one node under this Purview hub, and it's really what we're going to be focusing on today. And what records management allows us to do is a whole bunch of things. From the start, one of those things is file plan management. So what Purview calls the file plan would be like your retention schedule. This would be where you would define the records classifications for your organization, their corresponding retention periods, settings in relation to preservation. Do we want users to have to unlock records to be able to modify them, or leave them open during their retention period, for instance, and also configure the disposition outcomes. Who are the reviewers? Does it terminate in a review, or is there another transfer process at play? Automated classification is really the bread and butter of making Purview Records Management sing. We can do manual classification as well, but at Gravity Union, we really like to drive home automated classification as that way to go, and that end users don't typically take the time to classify things against the retention schedule, and if they do, they may make some mistakes. So in that automatic classification piece, we're defining those label policies, what Purview calls label policies. These are like rule sets that determine what gets automatically assigned to the retention schedule or that retention label in alignment with your business requirements. So is it after, say, the policy is approved? Is it after the meeting was at least a week ago? We can dial in those rule sets using those policies. Disposition is another piece here. So managing that end of the records life cycle with those disposition review processes to see whether we need to, say, extend the life cycle on a given artifact, relabel it, or approve it for destruction and log those review notes. And coming with this is also reporting. So you can see over time what is being classified against what classification or retention label, what is the growth over time, what are those collections. If they're distributed across many different sites, it provides an interface through the Data Explorer where you can see, say, all of the meeting records across the organization listed out for you in one spot. And for those who may be joining us who are maybe more in the information technology world and less so in the information management, records management world, a little recap. Records management is really about managing information in the idea that it has a life cycle. So it's created, it's collaborated upon. At some point, it stops really being worked on. It's final in that sense, and is ready to start classifying and put against its retention period. After that retention period, whatever that might be, in concert with legislative requirements, business requirements, it funnels through a disposition review most likely. So that's where those subject matter experts and your records management or records analysts may be taking a look at those things that are up for disposition and deciding, okay, are they ready for destruction? Is there another process where we have to transfer them to an archive, whatever that end of life cycle state needs to be? So put really simply, it's really all about finding what you have, knowing what you have, keeping what you need, and destroying what you don't. And how we approach records and information management is really an evolving story and an evolving dilemma. In the paper world, the asks of records management were a little more easily operationalized, and that the physicality of paper really asks that something be done with it, that growth is felt. Chaos is really visually seen in the office. We've all seen, I think, hallways lined with boxes at various employers in the past, and there are visible costs to mismanagement. There are clear efficiencies as well to sound management. We all know what a really well organized filing cabinet looks like versus a chaotic filing cabinet where you open it up and paper just starts coming out. Official files, corporate records in the past and sometimes in the present had a room, maybe a cabinet or a method that could ensure they would be found and eventually destroyed. And maybe we all know Gerald in the corner office has been hoarding his permits in his office since 1985, and that's a whole can of worms no one wants to touch, but this worked mostly. But most everywhere has really been challenged with taking this practice to the electronic domain for pretty obvious reasons. Something that was once the domain of knowledge workers and countless assistants has become seemingly self-serve and self-managing, as simple as creating new folders and new folders and folders and folders and folders. And if we look at the evolution of most org charts for any public body or corporation over the last 30 years, you'll probably see a prevailing trend. Those admins, those assistants, those records assistants that were tasked with managing the information, that paper information, are really largely no longer in the org chart. The information, however, has endured. And so in an organization with decades, say, of self-serve filing in place, what this leaves someone with the someone like the information professional with is a bit of an unenviable task. That information is looking like a churning heterogeneous stew of different filing practices over different periods of time, sometimes personal-led filing practices, sometimes entire abandoned folder directories just because someone new came into the organization who decided doing this to do something a little bit differently. So it becomes really quite difficult to figure out what any of these things can be sometimes. When it was from, when it was done, when it was obsolete or irrelevant. Is it obsolete or irrelevant? Is it a copy? Is it just a copy that lives somewhere else? And where's the authoritative source? Does this thing really does it need to be kept, or can we destroy it? So it becomes a little bit like looking at the ocean, trying to sort the fish inside. Purview's answer to this dilemma at a high level is an in-place approach. When done right, it preserves that feeling of self-serve work, that feeling that you can create a new space of work when you need to, but it's also folding in that records management largely behind the scenes. So when done right, rather than workers, say, in a more classical model taking up their finished work products, gathering Greg's copy, Leanne's copy, version 1, version 2, final, bundling them up, classifying them within a separate system or a more like official repository that they don't typically work in and where they'll probably never be able to find the thing again. And, you know, this is all a big ask too, and that they're probably not even going to do any of this in the first place. The work of assigning classification and retention instead in Purview is happening on an automatic cadence in the same place where people are collaborating, where they're drafting where they're completing their work products. So on the face, this looks like a really well-used and well-structured SharePoint site. Intuitive names for where to file, how to file, default metadata values wherever possible to minimize the ask for end user input and to make classification happen. And when that's in place, retention labels, so these little tags here, they're bound up with a clock in Purview. They're a timer job saying when the retention period starts for that record, how long that retention period is, and what happens after. And based on those predefined business rules that we put in the label policies, they'll distribute across the environment based on those intentional rules set by the business, going out to find those project records when the project is complete and label them with that, say, 5-year project retention. Following that period, it'll observe that period of time where it can't be deleted, and then following which it would be subject to that review for disposal and then potentially transfer to another custodian if this is more of an archive length thing. So instead of doing the work of finding that right classification from a laundry list of 10,000 options, packaging up the items, listing it up, and sending it off to be labeled by, say, an external EDRMS system, the labels are instead coming to the content. And when done right, the end user really barely knows it's happening. And this isn't all, of course, magic or a silver bullet. Success really requires structure. It's an approach that leads with really meeting the end user needs first to ensure that they actually really prefer using it, that they will continue to use it and manage their records in place there. And then while folding in any of that necessary information that we really must have to trigger or determine a retention period. Think something like a contract expiry, a project status. Usually this is metadata the end users need anyways. And so how do we make this magic, seeming magic, into something that's really feasible? So we'll be talking about some key lessons for adoption here. In planning for Purview, I want to talk about first, disciplinary partnership. It sounds a little kinky, but what I really mean is information management and information technology working hand in hand to make this thing sing. Talk about information architecture readiness as well, whether that being, really we'll be talking about SharePoint as that source repository where the records would be managed and how to structure that. You'll need to align your retention schedule with what Purview calls the file plan and its affordances. They won't look exactly the same. We'll talk a little bit about why and how. Also thinking about how to dial in automated classification so that end users aren't overburdened by it, but that it's still dialing in accurate retention period. And lastly, disposition management. There's some potential pitfalls that you can take, and so we'll have some hot tips on avoiding those and getting it right. So if you're going to leave this presentation with one message, I really would like you to know, take away that Purview Records Management really takes partnership to succeed. It needs partnership between your information, records and information professionals and your information technology groups. Maybe they live in the same department today, or maybe they don't, but they need to be brought together at the table when it comes to making this thing work well. It shouldn't be done in the tenor of a soap opera. Shout out to my mom across the pond and her love of Coronation Street. We don't want to see information management and information technology as soap opera rivals in any sense. IT shouldn't be approaching information management with a lift and shifted SharePoint design and keys to the kingdom to Purview saying, here's your records management system, drink up, figure it out. What we really want to happen is more in the tenor of like a WikiHow article illustration. So that kind of calm, open meeting of minds, each bringing something unique to the table, working out that best alchemy of Purview record keeping postures and information architecture decisions and implications together. Too often, I think we see organizations completely leave records and information management professionals out of the conversation around what tools to adopt and who should be given access to their use. So something I and my colleagues at GU take really seriously is elevating the voice and presence of records managers in these discussions around content management solutions and the adoption or use of technology tools. Connecting those spheres of information technology and records management that are too often disconnected despite their obvious commonalities around purpose and aim. So yeah, it really takes sharing strengths, sharing subject expertise, bringing together your SharePoint analysts, your records and information management analysts, and thinking about how do these align or misalign, and how do we make them talk to each other. And in thinking about that, we'll obviously need to determine roles for that records management solution in Purview. And this is an open question for a lot of organizations, and I think there's a different answer in most of them. So which staff, which area is really responsible and which are consulted when it comes to, say, in Purview, building and maintaining the file plan, that suite of retention labels. When it comes to configuring the classification, creating the label policies, and the search schema work that goes into that in the SharePoint side. Who's managing disposition of records reviews? Who's clicking the button to say these things are approved? Who's logging in the comments? For some organizations, they want to bring in business owners into that process. Some would like to manage it more centrally. And I have a recommendation about that to come as well. Who's going to be monitoring those compliance reports on a routine basis, and what does that monitoring cadence look like to make sure that labeling is continuing to happen and that any non-use, say, of or improper use of the SharePoint solution is noticed quickly. And end of life cycle flows. There's a new option with Purview when it comes to at the end of the retention period, you can trigger a custom Power Automate flow. Whose job is it to configure that? Whose job is it to monitor its success? And end user support. Who comes in when, say, for a very reasonable reason, a record needs to have its classification removed. Maybe someone dragged in a party photo to the policies library months ago and just noticed it now, and now it has permanent retention. That seems like a very reasonable time where someone is going to have to help with removing that classification. So who? We recommend documenting this in something like Erasy and having those conversations early on. An important part, I'd say the most important part when it comes to getting Purview Records Management working right is making sure that the information architecture and that source repository is in a good state to start working with. Having really well-defined information architecture in SharePoint is critical to your success. That's what I'd say the majority of Gravity Union's work will be when it comes to implementing a records management system with Purview. A lot of that work is getting SharePoint right and really in a good state for the end users as well as for records management. And this because automatic classification is query driven. We have to be able to run the same search every few days and have it bring back and label only the right things, only at the right time. It really requires then consistency in the ways that those records are organized and described. This can't just be one library with a whole bunch of folders that are self-serve folder creation of all different types of records. We need to be able to have that consistency in what that query is going to bring back. So if your SharePoint sites are in a current state where, oh, we lift and shifted from a network file storage, or it's a total free-for-all, we think we're labeling some folders with records classifications, oh, we're not really sure, then applying Purview is really going to be challenging. I would say it's going to be close to impossible. So if your Purview, or so if your SharePoint implementation looks like a messy desk, it means that you're probably not going to be able to come up with consistent queries that accurately auto-label content. Whereas if it looks a little bit more well-structured, purpose-built, well-designed, and consistently used, I think you're in a state where you could be ready for RM. And if you're wondering, okay, we've got SharePoint today, how do I know if I'm ready? How do I know if my org is ready? What does that good information architecture look like? Well, it pretty much always means you've got standard centralized management of the content type gallery in SharePoint. A content type is a notion of a document that, say, for instance, an invoice will have bundled with it all of the metadata required to understand an invoice. So the fact that it is an invoice is logged in the content type itself, as well as, say, the payment date, an approval status, whatever. If it's a project, maybe a close date, but having that notion of what the thing is bundled with that metadata in SharePoint is key. We want to reuse that configuration across the enterprise wherever we can, rather than have, say, date closed, close date, date of completion, date of closure, columns all over the environment. It's not the end of the world, but it's ideal if you just have one date closed column that you're reusing across the enterprise whenever you need to indicate closure. Single purpose document libraries with an enforced content type. This is probably the most important one. Have those document libraries be function driven. So not just one general documents library is probably the most common thing that we come across, but rather projects should go in the projects library, contracts should go in the contracts library, meeting records should go in the meeting records library. So carving those spaces out so that you can actually have some consistency in what those queries are pulling back. And typically, each of these libraries might map to only one records classification or schedule. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's a good kind of rule of thumb. But there are, of course, exceptions, but they should be known. They should be nameable. And really logical for the end user's use of hub sites to group related functions and information. So if you're a staff member in HR, having a drop down in your HR hub that allows you to easily navigate between the professional development site, the benefits site, the pay and compensation site, talent acquisition, etc., except for maybe the manager's portal, which might be more restricted access. But having that all be a click away from whatever site you're in to make sure that it really drives adoption. In moving to Purview, an early thing you'll need to do is think about your retention schedule today. Are you going to hit the threshold if you put every single classification into Purview? And what that threshold I mean is you get 1,000 retention labels per tenant in Purview. So too large a file plan, say you have 10,000 classifications because you work with the LGMA, you're going to be in a position where you're going to want to look for some ability to streamline those classifications. And I'll say I've never worked with a client where this limit has really posed an issue, even if they started with a retention schedule upwards of 10,000 classifications. There's often going to be some easy wins there. Things like, do you have a classification for every single committee that ever existed and all the committees are just permanent retention? In that case, you probably just need one label for committees, permanent retention. So look for those easy wins. Think, do we actually want the general category to be represented in our SharePoint build? Probably not. So those will often take out, 1,000 right there. If you go to a too small file plan, you're really going to lack granularity though. So sometimes I'm approached with, okay, let's make this easy. What if we just do 1 7-year, 1 10-year, 1 permanent, 1 3-year, and then we're done. We did records management. It sounds delightful, yes, except you're going to run into some issues if you simplify this a little too much. If you say have a general 7-year label, might sound like, okay, yeah, we've got a lot of 7-year categories that should work, except disposition review is going to channel these things by retention label at the end. So what you don't want is to be faced with a disposition review list of 100 potential records or disposition approvers that you have to triage to now and to understand what is what. And say the retention or the legislation changes on one of those 7-year categories, like say employee files, then you're going to be in a bit of a tricky situation of how do we identify just those 7-year employee files items and raise their retention without raising the retention of everything with it. So there's always a happy middle ground. It's usually getting to the secondary level of your file plan or your retention schedule, and also making some adjustments like getting rid of generals. And looking through your retention schedule as well, does it look technology ready? And by that, I mean, is it clear what is supposed to trigger retention in all cases, or what is the indicator that the thing is done? What we sometimes see is retention schedules that are full of SO triggers, so supersede, obsolete, but SO might have a slightly different definition depending on the classification. So does it mean the project's done? Does it mean the expiry is reached? Does it simply mean the policy is no longer in use? Often that will be spelled out in a retention schedule, but not always. So that might be that time to talk with your business units and figure out what does SO really mean here, because we'll want to capture that in the information architecture. So some common triggers to think about is it when the file was last modified? That's an easy one to do with Purview. Is it a dated event more likely, like a contract expiry? Is it when the thing is approved that we're ready to start counting retention on it and consider it done for collaboration? Is it simply the calendar or the fiscal year end? And as you proceed, you're ready to start getting into Purview. What I'll recommend is build that file plan on an as-needed basis. And what I mean by that is create a classification or a retention label in Purview the same week that you want to apply the policy to actually label the things. So don't feel like you've got to build out the whole file plan to reflect your retention schedule and then figure out the policies later. Do it chunk by chunk because you do get that 1,000 label limit. Another kind of thing to keep in mind is you can't rename your retention labels at this time. I feel like one day they might put in a display name, but not today. And often we can't delete them. So you don't want to charge too far ahead before you've made some kind of lessons learned and have had some successful implementations under your belt to know this is the design pattern that we want, and we can point to some examples in our environment for where this has worked well. Do create them on an as-needed basis instead, rather than all at once. I think there are really only benefits to doing it that way. And some risks in not doing it that way. The benefits are you can leverage some of the new features on the development roadmap as they release. Purview is constantly releasing updates, and I have seen updates in the past that don't affect prior retention labels created prior to the update. So if you wait, you may have more options under your belt for how to use that label. You can also get that opportunity to hone and refine your design patterns as you over time as you learn what settings are really going to work best in your organization. You might want to start off with full intention to use Purview's event retention feature and then decide it's a little bit more maintenance that we'd like and we're going to take a different retention basis in future for these events. You don't want to paint yourself into a corner so that you're out of file plan space to make those changes. So save on that file plan space. It is finite. In designing that file plan, kind of one of the keyest, most important questions that you have to think about as an organization, and this will really be an organization posture. It's something I like to talk with clients about early and often, is what is your stance to locking content down? In Purview, a retention label can be what's called standard retention or record retention. And record retention sounds very enticing as records managers because, yeah, it's a record. But how Purview defines a record is its own little spin on it. What a Purview record is it's introducing a lock on the content. It means that folks have to manually unlock content whenever they need to modify it after that thing is labeled. So it's a little bit more friction for the end users, and it also has a storage impact as well. Whereas with the retain or standard option, you still get quite a bit of control and preservation around those items. You can't delete the version history. There is a tenant setting where you can also prevent things from being deleted and sent to a secondary preservation location. So there is a lot that you can do with the standard label that ultimately is still a record. Here's a little table that you can memorize at home on the difference of standard versus record retention labels. I really recommend if you're about to start building out your file plan in Purview, get to know this distinction really well and come up with a posture of we're only going to use standard, or we are going to use record, but only in these select circumstances. There are some kind of additional tape you're going to put into place if you go with a record retention label that you may not actually have intended. For instance, if a record is ever unlocked at any point in its life cycle, it means we can't move it between sites down the road. So think about those kinds of limitations as well, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Some factors to think about when you're deciding record versus standard. I clearly have a preference probably. Placing too much restriction on how your end users work are going to dissuade, it's going to dissuade your solutions adoption, or at least it's going to ask a lot more training for end users to recognize what does a lock to record look like, so that they're not just bombarding you with IT requests because they can't modify their document. Introducing a lock too early is also going to have storage impacts. So if something's still in collaboration phase when that label and that lock comes in, it means they're going to be unlocking and locking a lot. And every time you unlock, it's going to produce a unique copy of that record in the preservation hold library of kind of its pre-modification uh, uh, document. So you're going to get a lot of stuff in that preservation hold library. You can't push it out. It's going to stay there until the retention period is reached, and say this is a permanent retention item. It's there forever. And do you intend to move that content out of place to another container, maybe later in the life cycle, like another site? Not always possible if you go with the record option. Standard will give you a lot more options when it comes to moving things down the road, and it still gives you that undeletable version history. Another thing that we reach when we're designing the retention label is deciding what's the end outcome of this retention label. After the thing has met its period of time, what happens? Out of the box, Purview gives us a disposition option. So that's usually the way we're going to go when it comes to records. And it gives us up to 5 stages. So those 5 stages, I think, is a bit of an invitation to say, let's bring in the business owners to conduct those reviews in Purview. Makes a lot of sense. But I will say, proceed with caution. If you give, say, business owners the ability to approve disposition for a given record category, it gives them the full suite of options for disposition. So they can approve disposal, they can extend the life cycle by hundreds of years if they so choose, or they could relabel it to any other item in your file plan. And these last two, extend and relabel, for some reason, do not require successive approvals in the chain. So consider limiting those disposition reviews to a few well-trained hands. If we bring in business owners, it's going to mean you really want to train them very well on the ins and outs and the risks of different choices they can make in the review process. Often, organizations I work with will prefer to keep this centrally managed in the central records office and parse and send out those review lists for a sent outside of Purview. But it is a design choice, but keep in mind there are potential risks of bringing everyone into the table. All right, so we made our file plan. Now it's time to automate some classification. So when we're automating our retention, it's really going to benefit from, again, I sound like a bit of a broken record, function-driven information architecture where those records are being managed. Really consistent solution designs, consistent in the sense that if a close date is needing to be triggered on for retention, that close date is the same column that's being used as a close date elsewhere, wherever content is being closed, and really well considered choices around when content's ready to automatically label it and be retained in the solution. This is a big one too. We want to dial in that automatic classification at just the right time, not so early that folks are going to drive themselves away back to OneDrive, for instance, because I can't delete anything here. And sharp keyword query language skills. So KQL is the query syntax that we use for automatic classification. It's one of the bigger learning curves when it comes to Purview Records Management. It's a language that can be used to search in Purview out of the box, but it's something that we have to use when it comes to Purview. I'll show you some examples of that in the case study. Or one example at least. Oh, and here we are. So I will show you now a case example from a municipality that we've worked with in the past of how to make their records retention accurate when it comes to their council meeting site. So we worked with this client to implement a solution for their council meetings. Now, the majority of these records, given that they were council, were permanent, so they're not like the most dazzling examples of retention management. So I'm going to focus on one specific type of record, their distribution lists that were a 10-year retention. But you'll see here, we've got that beautiful hub architecture connecting different sites together, one click away at any given time from where folks need to work. And within that, each of these would have function-driven libraries in association with the records that they manage. So the challenge in this scenario, And this is going to be a common challenge if you're implementing Purview. You want to classify all the council and committee meeting records against the retention schedule. And then the specific example I'll show you, we also want to do the distribution list items that have a 10-year retention. We, in this case, want to apply the record retention label to make sure that content is protected against erroneous modifications. So there's a design choice you can make to, if you don't publish out for manual selection or retention label in a site, means they can't use the lock unlock function. So we did this in such a way so that the lock is, it's a lock, it stays a lock. We want to ensure that record label is not applied too early, because if folks are still working on it, they can't necessarily unlock it. If they accidentally drag a party photo in, they can't delete it. We don't necessarily need that to be a permanent or 10-year record. And we want to, and this is actually the trickiest part, ensure that all those parts of the meeting file or the distribution list are eligible for review in unison. In this case, all the different files associated with those distribution lists are connected to that meeting date. We want all those files to show up at the same time so that we don't have parts of a case file expiring at different times. And why that's tricky is because Purview will label things on the per document level. So we want to make sure that all those different parts of the document, even if they're labeled at different times, are sharing the same end date. In this case, it's by labeling them at the same time. So what we needed is for one, SharePoint had to have the right information architecture in place. So here's an example of a nice information architecture. We've got a clearly named library, council meetings, open. If we wanted and if we needed to, that meeting type could be a driver for classification. Say if a public hearing and a regular meeting had different retention requirements or classification requirements. In this case, all we needed was one, for the content type to be in place that's default, so that anytime someone drags this thing in, it's recognized as a distribution list document or a council meeting document. And two, we needed that meeting date. That's all we needed though. In this case for auto classification. Meeting type was useful to the end users, so they wanted it. That video link, useful to the end user, so they wanted it. There were some other pieces and other columns, but we really just needed this one, and it's something they already needed. So I'm not adding extra work to do the auto classification here. So those defined automatically assigned content types. This is a document set case structure. If you've never seen a document set before, it's like a fancy folder that pushes down metadata. Really a very, like my best friend when it comes to records management in SharePoint, and metadata that's meaningful to the end user, so meeting date. We needed the right retention label for the job. So thinking about what is that retention schedule in our our paper file plan, and how is that going to speak to the Purview file plan? Is there any kind of crosswalking we need to do to make those match up? So our retention basis in this case, we're going to count retention from the day the thing was labeled. This is going to help us with case file management in this case, because every time that job runs out to label new items based on a query, if it matches the conditions, it's going to label all the contents in the case file at once. And thus, they show up for disposition at the same time. The retention length, in this case, we needed to bump it up a year. So it was a calendar year plus 10. Because Purview is going to label things all throughout the year, bump it up a year to make sure we're rounding off all that full calendar year. We need an effective auto label policy. So this is where that ugly little KQL comes in. What this is saying is the content type has to be a distribution list document that's defaulted in the location where those distribution lists were being managed. So anytime someone puts something in, that property is being added by default. And in this case, this little code word means meeting date, refinable date 00. The meeting date was before last month. So what that means is if this job were to run today, all the meetings August and prior would run, would get labeled, and if it was a meeting in September, it's got a little bit more grace period. It's not going to get labeled until November. So folks have lots of time after the meeting to finish filing their records. We can dial this in a little tighter till say last week, but last month is a nice kind of happy medium where we've never heard that folks needed to delete something once the thing got labeled since. The result we see these meeting records get labeled and they're going to proceed to disposition review in unison. So that locks the indicator that the label was applied for us. And in this case, this is still obviously in a live solution. What I would expect if I were to visit this environment today would be that the September and the October council meeting records have not been labeled yet, but the ones August and prior have. So records not labeled until work on them is definitely complete. Staff don't have to think about the classification. They're just working with the solution as it was designed for them in ways that are meaningful to them, and they're staying in compliance. Now, this last little hot tip for you is around streamlining event retention. I promise I won't make, this will be a quick one. Event retention is kind of weird in Purview. I think that if you're someone who has dived deep into Purview in the past, you're going to get a lot out of this hot tip. If you haven't, this is just going to be noise, so just bear with me. Purview has a type of retention called event for its retention labels, and it's a very desirable choice in the sense that a lot of retention schedules are based on events. There are other ways of handling them in Purview. You just saw one. If we base the retention schedule off when the label is applied, but event retention is the other option. And what that means is you label the thing, it's indefinite until it receives this event. And if you're going by the Microsoft documentation on this, it's going to look like a very high bar to meet. The idea is, okay, the contract expires, somehow the records management or Purview administrators are notified of this fact. They then populate a column, the asset ID, on every single record associated with that event at the document level. This can't be pushed down from a document set. We've got to reindex to make sure that the system knows everything has that asset ID, and then we can create the retention event because it goes out once. So if the indexing isn't done, you're going to have to run it again. Sounds like science fiction. Instead, what you can do is this is something I've landed on with my colleagues. This is an alternative approach you can take to make this more of an annual cadence. Avoid that asset ID field for creating events. Hot tip, you don't have to use it. It is referenced in the Microsoft documentation and it's provided whenever you have an event-based label, but you don't have to use it. It's extra work to populate or automate. You can't share it from a document set. In my opinion, there's no reason to use it. Instead, you can leverage a date field that's already in your environment that mirrors your retention trigger to create that event. So think an expiry date on contracts, a termination date on employee files, an end date on project files, for instance. So this is being pushed down from a document set in this contracts library, and I can actually call on that when I want to make my event instead. Then you can create that when you're creating that retention event. You can cover a range of dates instead. Here in Purview, it'll say asset IDs. What it's asking for is potentially that asset ID field, but you don't have to use it. It actually will support the same keyword query language conditions as any other auto apply label policy. So in this example, I'm saying the expiry date was between the 1st of January in 2023 or up to December 31st, 2023. I can set that event for January 1st, 2024. Oops, slight difference there. And then it's going to start counting that 7 years from there. So you just made that kind of million-minute process more of a 30-minute one tops if you include quality assurance. So some key takeaways. I see some implications here for our records and information management professionals for sure. There's really a demand when it comes to Purview Records Management and other sort of in-place classification systems for really increased partnership and collaboration between these spheres of records and information managers, privacy experts, and IT professionals. Everyone should be at the table when it comes to, we're going to start using SharePoint as our go-to records management or document repository system. Make sure that everyone's at the table to make sure, what does that mean in terms of our compliance requirements? Can we meet our compliance requirements? And let's make sure that we can. It means less onus long-term to coach staff on the ins and outs of classification codes and the retention schedule in the first place. Really, the work can then be about coaching them about where to file things in the repository that is built for them with their input rather than knowing the codes. More focus too, long-term on governance and guidance on the use of these technologies to support records and information management. And we're seeing some evolving job descriptions in terms of the records and information analyst may now be someone who's also configuring Purview, working with the SharePoint search schema. I see different answers to who owns this. And I see more hybridized roles as a result. Some key takeaways to think about is it of course takes planning before you implement Purview Records Management. If you have a lift and shifted SharePoint environment, you might need a little bit of reworking to get it right for Purview. It takes a really strong foundation going back to that information architecture, governance, and a strong relationship between information managers and information technology staff. It takes partnership between them to really get this thing to work right. And when it does work right, it's a dream. I'm not kidding. It's amazing to see folks working in a way that's intuitive for them without necessarily realizing that they're kind of also eating their compliance vegetables without necessarily knowing. Whenever I pop in for former clients where I've implemented auto classification and say, how's it like, and anyone asking why they can't delete a certain file or asking for the labels to be removed on anything, it's never like, oh, they don't seem to really notice, but in the best possible way, that auto classification is really happening in alignment with their business processes without having to follow up and chase. So we would really thank you so much for your time today. We are, of course, going to take your questions. Before we do, I would invite everyone to also learn more. Watch your email. There's going to be a recording and some slides to come. Read those related articles on our blog. So we've got some links here, but there are tons. It's really great writers that I work with, putting amazing intellectual content in there all the time. So keep an eye on that. And please, I would love for you to join our next webinar on Copilot and AI readiness.